watch the environmental movement. They had their big clam bake down in Rio last summer, the so-called Earth Summit, principally to bring about a clean earth and global environmentalism, a global environmental protection agency. But in reality, they basically wrote a new world constitution. And that's what the whole environmental movement is about, is to push us into socialism and towards the New World Order. If you're a hardcore environmentalist, then you probably worship Mother Gaia. Mother Gaia is the so-called goddess of the planet Earth. I think probably she, in fact, is a demon. But you'll find tremendous occultic connections in this whole group that's pushing for the New World Order.
So what is the Jews' religion? All right, what is the Jews' religion? Well, how many of you have ever heard of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? See, this document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, may or may not be a forgery. I'm not here this morning to defend it. I've been taught for years in every class I had and every study that I did on it that it is an absolute and complete fabrication, that it has no basis in fact. But the problem is that when you get into the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, begin to look at some of the things that they say in there, it's amazing at how it's happening. And the protocols showed up in the late 1800s in Russia. And like I say, once again, this is not here to defend the veracity of this thing, but to simply say it does exist. And now, how many of you have ever heard of a man named Henry Ford? Good. Hallelujah. Henry Ford, a lot of people know this if they study much in it. They know that Henry Ford would be what you would call anti-Semitic. How many's ever heard the term anti-Semitic? How many understand that a term can become a term can become a thing that becomes to use the term, you're immediately condemned, and you have no day in court, you have no opportunity to defend yourself, that if you're branded as that, you're finished. Okay? All right. Okay. How many of you can think of a few other terms like that today? All right, everybody can. Okay. So Henry Ford was branded as anti-Semitic. Now let's put a few things together. When did Henry Ford live? When did he begin to, and what made, he didn't invent the car, you all know that, but what he did is invent mass production of the car and created an assembly line and started making the Model T, a car that everybody could, a lot of people could afford. And, you know, he was a car manufacturer. He was an entrepreneur. He was a very smart man. And he made a lot of money and made a lot of automobiles, and Ford Motor Company is still around. Here we are, you know, a long time. Well, let me say this. In the 1920s, America apparently was experiencing a certain amount of a boom. And Henry Ford was booming in the 20s, and the Ford Motor Company. And they were building. Henry Ford, though, being the kind of man that he was the kind of man who if he got in a boat, he'd want to know what held the boat up, where it was headed, how you got to where you were going, and what was on the bank. Who's standing on this side and who's standing on that side? Who told us to get in this boat? And whose idea was it to begin with, where we're headed? In other words, all these things he wanted to know. Why did he want to know that? He wanted to know that because of the kind of man he was. He was a very observant man, very observant. He came to a conclusion. The conclusion that Henry Ford came to was that the Jew runs everything. And he created a document, a set of books, five volumes, called The International Jew. And he published a newspaper once a month, I think it's monthly, called the Dearborn Independent. And this is Dearborn, Michigan, right? Michigan. And Michigan became the auto state, of course, Detroit, Michigan, and so on. So he created this. He created this volume, 4-volume booklets, pamphlets, published, distributed in the early 20s by Henry Ford, an American industrialist and automobile manufacturer. Why did he do it? He did it because he was firmly convinced that the Jew, now when you say the Jew, you have to get into what are you talking about, the Jew. We'll get that, we'll deal with that in a minute. But he was convinced that the Jew was running everything. Being an industrialist like he was, he needed money, he needed capital, he needed to invest, he needed to expand, he needed to buy raw materials and so forth. You know, all these things you have to deal with when you're a businessman like him, running a company like that. And because of that, he had international connections. He was dealing with foreign countries. He bought raw material from foreign countries. And I don't know if he smelted his own, I don't know if he made his own steel or not. I don't know how deep he got into it, but Henry Ford was quite a builder, an industrialist. And he was firmly convinced that the Jew was running everything. Now let's just set that aside and set the protocols of Zion aside for just a moment. Now let's read something else. Albert Pike, time and again you've heard me mention him. Now listen to this. Pike was said to be a Satanist who indulged in the occult. He apparently possessed a bracelet which he used to summon Lucifer. Pike made no bones about the fact that Lucifer was his god. Remember we talked about Lucifer? With whom he had constant communication. He was the Grand Master of a Luciferian group known as the Order of the Palladium, or Sovereign Council of Wisdom, which had been founded in Paris 1737. Palladianism had been brought to Greece from Egypt by Pythagoras in the 5th century, and it was this cult of Satan that was introduced to the inner circle of the Masonic lodges. It was aligned with the Palladium of the Templars. In 1801, Isaac Long, a Jew, brought a statue of Baphomet, Satan, to Charleston, South Carolina. How many's ever seen a statue of Baphomet? I don't know if you really want to see it. You probably don't need to see a statue of Baphomet. Let me just say this, it is one of the most godless, lewd things you've ever seen in your life. They brought this to Charleston, South Carolina, where he helped to establish the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. Long apparently chose Charleston because it was geographically located on the 33rd parallel of latitude. Incidentally, so is Baghdad. And this council is considered to be the Mother Supreme Council of all Masonic lodges of the world. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But now, leave that aside for just a moment, and let me read to you a quote from the Protocols of Zion. Remember what I mentioned about them? I'm not here to defend them, to even say that they're nothing but a fabrication. But when 2 and 2 begins to connect, and when you judge a tree by the fruit it bears, you have to start looking again at what's going on. Listen carefully. This is a direct quotation that I took from the Protocols of Zion. Meanwhile, until we come into our kingdom, we shall act in a contrary way. We shall create and multiply free Masonic lodges in all the countries of the world, absorb them into all who may become or who are prominent in public activity. For these lodges we shall find our principal intelligence office and means of influence. All these lodges we shall bring under one central administration known to us alone, and to all others absolutely unknown, which will be composed of our learned elders. The lodges will have their representatives who will serve to screen the above-mentioned administration of Masonry, and from whom will issue the watchword and program. In these lodges we shall tie together the knot which binds together all revolutionary and liberal elements. Their composition will be made up of all strata of society. The most secret political plots will be known to us and fall under our guiding hands on the very day of their conception. Among the members of these lodges will be almost all the agents of international and national police, since their service is for us irreplaceable. In the respect, the police is in position not only to use its own particular measures with the insubordinate, but also to screen our activities, provide pretext for discontent, so forth and so on, and create a one world government. And that's their goal, a one world government. I got to digging around in this thing, and I thought to myself, now wait a minute. Henry Ford said this in the 20s. All right? Henry Ford's a very rich man. They're building Model Ts in the 20s. Okay. 1929, the stock market crashed. Remember that. That's an important date. 1929, the stock market crashed. Men jumped out of the windows. They jumped out of the skyscrapers. They killed themselves. They were paupers overnight. 1929, the stock market crashed. All right, now, the day before it crashed in 1929, let's just say there was $7 trillion in the world. The day after the stock market crashed, there was still $7 trillion in the world. But the money supply in the United States of America dried up.